False Start, a college football podcast for everyone and everyone else. I'm your host, John Buhler, lead writer for FanSided. As you can see, once again, I am flying solo like a cup with Cody Williams, content director, fansided.com, at the Super Bowl, covering Super Bowl 60 between the Patriots and the Seahawks. Definitely check him out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. He's just a web sensation right now. But this podcast is about college football. But before we begin, be sure to hit that like button, smash that subscribe button, give this thing a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere there's podcasts. The show must go on, and I will continue to do that, and I will keep this thing on the tracks as best as I can. Have tomorrow off. Just did false start. I'm doing false start now. Just did blog and already wrote a bunch, so I'm pretty cooked. So this episode's going to be all over the place. So without further ado. Let's get rolling here with our first and 15 today, which is he gone. Gus Malzahn is retiring from the coaching profession after some 35 years of doing it. An icon, an absolute legend. I was sitting there thinking about this, when we did our false start Hall of Fame, the previous episode that Cody was on, or 2 ones from now. Like who's going to be our coach that we're going to be putting in here? We had Gundy in there. I mentioned that like our contributor is probably going to be Mike Leach. In all honesty, feel like he's kind of just part of the culture. Honestly, if Gus Malzahn's retiring, come on, boys, let's go. Let's hurry up, boys, let's go. Just having him in there, I think that fits the bill right there of exactly what this show is about. Inspired some of the best graphic design is my passion, but let's be real with this. So Gus Malzahn, I think he played briefly at Arkansas, former wide receiver in the 80s. I think he came up through the coaching ranks of, Christian high school football in Arkansas. His greatest mentee was Rhett Lashley, who's now doing extraordinary things at SMU. And it was very interesting to me, in retrospect, now that I realize that he's stepping down, he's no longer going to be, in the game as a coach. I was kind of wondering, like, maybe why didn't Arkansas hire him? Ryan Silverfield, I know, did fantastic work there at Memphis, kind of in the same sort of backyard, but like, Gus is one of their own. But maybe his heart wasn't in it anymore. Maybe kind of after how this past year went, trying to time it all together to see what Tommy Castellanos can do, at quarterback, playing for FSU, coming in there and working for Mike Norvell, another guy with Arkansas ties from his days playing at Central Arkansas. It kind of seemed like this was a good time to kind of go out. Obviously, Florida State did not have the season that any of us expected. I mean, they beat Alabama week 1 at Doak Campbell, and then they won 4 games the rest of the year. Really struggled in ACC play once again under Mike Norvell. And again, I'll touch on Mike Norvell here, probably in our next segment. Definitely going to do that. But with Malzahn retiring, that it's a very interesting because of what he did, at one of his probably his most famous job, which was Auburn. And obviously, I know he kind of came up there as the OC under Gene Chizik there in 2010. Cam Newton was a star player, Michael Dyer at running back, the late Philip Lutzenkirchen at tight end, obviously Nick Fairley on the defensive line, everything like that. Just one of the most out of the blue national champions, in recent memory. But I think it was kind of like Malzahn just having his offense that I always said was like hurry up and run. This was a guy that used athletes and really took advantage of big defensive linemen just sucking wind and really broke a lot of people's will. And I think more importantly, when he was at Auburn, because again, I think he was there from like 13 to like 2020, so about 8 years. I think he won the SEC once in 13, his first year there. And then I think played for another SEC division, the Crown, in 2017, lost to Georgia. That was the Jarrett Stidham team. I bet Auburn misses him a lot. It's really been a very challenging last several years since he left. Obviously, I think I saw somewhere out there TJ Finley has since he last played at Auburn has seen 3 coaches fired at Auburn, with that being Malzahn, with that be Brian Harsin, with that being Hugh Freeze, now with Alex Golesh taking over. But with Malzahn, I always kind of felt like his scheme was very rudimentary. It wasn't a whole lot of think. It was just a lot of do, a lot of go, a lot of stuff. But he won a lot of games, caught a lot of people by surprise. Maybe the game kind of caught up to him with, people being more in tune with substitutions going up against spread offenses. Obviously, once he got let go at Auburn, he went to UCF. That was still a group of five team, and then that became, a power four team. Obviously, UCF kind of had some struggles there initially upon joining the Big 12. But the way that I'll probably remember Malzahn is just kind of he just kind of fit Auburn. And for a program that's kind of been seedy throughout most of my life, whether that's employing guys like Hugh Freeze, Senator Tuberville, Terry Bowden, and a bunch of other stuff. Gus kind of cut through it. Gus was the head coach of Auburn when my sister went there, and she was, I think, a sophomore, during the 2013 team that went to the national championship, with Nick Marshall at quarterback, with Trey Mason in the backfield, Greg Robinson along the offensive line. Again, he didn't have the most talented teams, but he could get buy-in in a way that I think a lot of his coaching contemporaries just couldn't do. So, visors off to Gus Malzahn. The Gus bus, has stopped in Tallahassee, after the thing ran off the wheels. But he's just an SEC legend. And I think the other thing that I'm always going to remember about him is he was one of the few coaches that really gave Nick Saban trouble. And again, like he was at Auburn, I think during the peak of Saban, when he was at Alabama. He would win, he would win just enough Iron Bowls to keep it interesting, just enough games in the Deep South's oldest rivalry, the Tiger Bowl. Just really a head coach that I think even though he wasn't running the most complicated scheme, it would always like be a thorn in the side for everybody else. And I think in a way like that kind of encapsulates what Auburn football is at its best. It recruits at a top 15 level. It's not always going to win everything because you've got the double stack of home and road with Alabama and Georgia in the same year. When it's on the road, it's very tough. I mean, Auburn hasn't won in Georgia since the Bush administration. Which one doesn't matter? Who cares? But Gus Malzahn at Auburn was a game changer. And I think that I think when you have a coach like that whose tenure was not quite a decade, but certainly had some success, we have to kind of unpack that a little bit more in a vacuum. And I think in a way, I'm not saying he cursed Auburn, but the the Tigers have not been the same program since he was let go. And obviously, different ADs and everything like that. It's just kind of been challenging. With Alan Green, it didn't work out. Obviously, right now, with John Cohen, it didn't work with Hugh Freeze, but he got to pick Alex Golesh. So we'll see what happens there. But pour one out for the Gus Bus, just a tremendously important head coach, and not just the SEC, not just in the Big 12 American, but kind of what we do here a little bit on false start. So yeah, that's what kind of got there for he gone. And I'm going to go with the next topic here with some do Haas or do Hast. So with Gus Malzahn stepping aside and retiring, Mike Norvell is going to be taking over play calling. Co-offensive coordinator and receivers coach Tim Harris is now the full-time OC, but he's not calling plays. So do Haas or do Haas? Will Mike Norvell calling plays get Florida State, back on track in the ACC? I've gone back and forth on this one a lot since I kind of wrote that prompt. I'm going to go do Haas 1S. Yeah, I think it will. Mostly because, well, it has to. I mean, I'm off the top of my head, I can't tell you who the starting quarterback is for Florida State right now with Tommy Cat on the way to whatever he's doing now. But I think the biggest and most important thing when it comes to Mike Norvell in this role, in this elevated role, is Michael Alford, the AD. And we obviously know Florida State is cash strapped right now. So I think a lot of times when you are strapped for cash, life, business, whatever it might be, that's where innovation comes out of it. Because the mother of necessity is invention. And I think even though Norvell is more of like a receivers coach, that's kind of what he cut his teeth as. I think that there's a way where it's kind of like less is more. Look, a couple of years ago when you had the 23 team, the one that went 13-0 in the ACC, and then you lose Jordan Travis forever, in the penultimate game versus North Alabama. You still beat Louisville, and then you don't make the playoff because you don't have the quarterback. You get smoked by Georgia in the Orange Bowl, and then it's just gone to hell in a handbasket ever since. Norvell, he fired his coaches, obviously the shortly after that, right, the 24 season, if you will. Alex Atkins didn't cut it as OC. Obviously, Adam Fuller, I believe, was the Adam Fuller, I think that was the DC for them. It didn't work. You go in there, you make some changes, you bring in Gus Malzahn, you get Tommy Castellanos transferring from BC, the guy he used to know want to play for the Knowles, who Gus Malzahn recruited at UCF and everything like that. I kind of feel like less is more, you know, just being like, look, if we don't make a bowl game here, everybody's gone. Like you also got to remember your biggest rival in conference is Miami. Even though Miami didn't win the ACC a year ago, they played for a national championship. And let's be real, let's be honest with ourselves. At this stage of the game, who are you honestly going to pick to win the ACC over Miami next year? I might be leaning SMU, another year with Kevin Jennings, but I believe they lost Casey Woods to a head coaching opportunity. I think he's with Missouri State now, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong in that regard. Georgia Tech will be pretty good, but obviously, you got to see what Alberto Mendoza is going to do playing for George Godsey. Again, it's not Aaron Philo replacing Haynes King and Buster Faulkner's offense. It's a whole totally different paradigm there, just down the road here in Atlanta for me. Um, but look, Florida State's they got to figure this out because Florida made the moves that Florida State did not do. UCF's got Scott Frost back there. We'll see what the Knights do in year two with him back at the helm in Orlando. Obviously, South Florida had a tremendously great season there under Alex Golesh. We'll see what Brian Hartline's going to bring to Tampa. And then, obviously I mentioned, Miami's doing great. Clemson's kind of okay. Maybe we'll see what they do with Vizina at quarterback instead of Kate Klubnik. Maybe that'll be good for the Tigers. You got to find a way. And I was writing about this, or I was sitting there thinking about this. I wrote this for Kane's Warning, again, more of a Miami-centric site, kind of on the idea of Norvell being the play caller. Obviously, Miami's got to be excited about this. It's like, wow, we got the head coach who's kind of in a more compromised situation. We're still able to retain Shannon Dawson as OC, Corey Heatherman as DC. This is all good for us. This is coming up for us. And obviously, as some of the NFL coaching staffs are still trying to, come together. I mean, like, or just like a couple of days ago, Mike LaFleur got hired by the Cardinals. It all looks like Clint Kubiak's going to take over in Las Vegas, so we'll see what happens there. But I'll say this, like when you look beyond Miami of who like the serious contenders are in the ACC next year, you got to go like five or six teams before you even talk about Florida State. Like I'd say SMU is certainly up there. Georgia Tech, Virginia. Virginia Tech might be good. Duke won it a year ago. NC State could be dazzling. Obviously, Wake Forest had a fantastic year under first year head coach Jake Dickert. I mean, there's Pitt's also a factor in this too. Louisville, a team that we keep sleeping on. You got to go down like basically like how many more teams are left to be picked in the ACC beyond Florida State? I mean, what maybe trying to think who's really down. Like Syracuse, I mean, they had a 9-1 season a couple of years ago. Stanford, Cal. Okay, they're bringing in new coaches with Tavita Pritchard and Tosh Lapoy, guys back at their alma maters and everything like that. So, but the reason I'm going to say Du Hast 1S, this is a good idea for Florida State. It's like, look, you got nothing left to lose at this point. And I think Norvell's going to have to wear this or eat this one way or another. He's either going to look like a genius or he's going to look like a fool. And I think at that point, the most important thing here is we're going to get resolution. And look, if this works out with Norvell, he's like, you know what? I'm confident enough. I'm going to do this. I'm promoting Tim Harris from within. And look, with Malzahn retiring, this wasn't like abrupt or sudden. Like maybe you and I who follow along with the sport nationally may have been like kind of surprised by this, but like maybe this is something that uh, Florida State knew was going to happen for a while. And if that's the case, then more power to Norvell to see if he can make this work. Like Florida State's been a challenging job, and he's won at a high level before, just not as much as he probably should. There's always one outlier every year that wins the league. I mean, hell, last year there was a point in time for about a month where we were comfortable with Florida State being a top 10 team in the country. And then they lost to Virginia. So, I'm rooting for Mike Norvell here because it's good for Florida State and it's good for college football if Florida State's good. So that's kind of what I got here with that. Let's move on to our third topic of the day with It Don't Mean Enough. I wrote my first article ever for Wildcat Blue Nation. Shout out to Drew Holberg for letting me do this. I don't know if this is necessarily registering within Big Blue Nation and everything like that because it's basketball time. But I saw that Will Stein, their incoming head coach from Oregon, the OC there, former Louisville quarterback, my peer, he appeared on Andy and Ari on Three. And he was obviously talking to the co-host of that program, Andy Staples and Ari Wasserman, two guys that Cody and I absolutely adore and respect so much in this industry. Um, I forget exactly who maybe asked the question. It could have been Andy Staples. It could have been Ari Wasserman. I don't know. But Will Stein was there in his office, and he said he kind of he put out the whole "Why not us" mantra. And honestly, I kind of got fired up with that. Look, and I think it's a very challenging spot for Kentucky because you know, prior to him getting terminated, Mark Stoops was the longest tenured head coach in the league, longer than Kirby Smart, longer than Eli Drinkwitz, longer than everybody. I mean, he'd been in that role since what, 2013. Like he got hired the same cycle that Gus Malzahn did at Auburn, if you can believe it or not. And under his watch, the first like two-thirds of his tenure, I mean, Kentucky would win 9 or 10 games every couple of years. Granted, I think that they took advantage of a very down SEC East. Obviously, that went away. I think Kentucky was probably hurt more by realignment in the SEC than anybody, just because, it probably helped Ole Miss more than anybody else. I think that kind of was held true eventually. But I feel like Will Stein's coming in here. And look, even though he played a rival Louisville, who cares? He knows this is a huge opportunity. And in a way, like this was a job of intrigue. I mean, we kind of knew that like Kentucky might move on from Stoops, but one of their own, Kentucky alum, John Summerall was out there. We touched on him in the previous episode. He went to Florida, after having great success there at Tulane and Troy. Previously, he's trying to channel his inner Urban Meyer. And I think Will Stein's trying to channel his inner Chris Ignetti. Why not us? And I think getting Kenny Minchie at quarterback, over from Notre Dame, who was briefly committed to Nebraska, that's huge. I mean, yeah, you lose Cutter Boley, a guy who I thought is really talented, but he's going to replace Sam Levitt there for Kenny Dillingham at Arizona State. Again, probably going to learn more about Cutter Boley this year, playing for my fiance's alma mater and everything like that. But I just kind of felt like Will Stein, just the way he conducted himself. Again, prior to like this, I hadn't really seen a whole hell of a lot of him. Like I couldn't honestly pick him out from a lineup for a while. I'm like, this is kind of an anonymous like play caller. And he told Andy Nari, he's like, look, every play that I've ever called on offense, I always thought could go for a touchdown. Granted, I mean, that's kind of hokey, that's kind of cheesy, sticky stuff, but for some reason it just landed with me very well. I thought that was kind of cool. Well, Kentucky's the place where Hal Mummy and Mike Leach kind of got the air raid going. I mean, in the late 90s with Tim Couch. Like, if that didn't happen, we don't have the air raid in college football. That was a place. Again, we were talking about this with Mike Norvell. Necessity is the mother of invention. You know, you have boosters, you have places there. It's not the most like fertile recruiting territory, but like you got to figure this out. He's like, we don't just want to make it interesting. We want to beat people. When Coach Sig left JMU, we're like, why are you going to Indiana? You're in your mid 60s. Is this really where you want your coaching career to end? Like, are you actually going to be able to achieve? I mean, Indiana's success prior to Coach Sig getting there was to make a bowl game occasionally. They did that a little bit under Tom Allen and Kevin Wilson and other coaches before that, Lee Corso and other guys. But like, Indiana's never been this until now. Not to say that Kentucky is going to do that because I think Indiana doing this has kind of been singular. It's kind of been lightning in a bottle. And again, maybe I'll be wrong, but like this is a new era and they've just figured it out. But that doesn't mean that Kentucky can't figure it out. Look, I've actually watched the game at Kroger Field back when it was called Commonwealth Stadium. People pack that thing. People love that team. It's not very good, but like people will show up. They love to party there too. My one of my fraternity's closest chapters was in Kentucky, so we used to always kind of do a home and home whenever we could. So I'm always rooting for the guys at UK as best as I can. Just will never beat Georgia. But anyway, I just found that conversation, that little snippet there. Again, you can check that article out on wildcatbluenation.com. Not the greatest URL, but it's Drew Holbert does a good job. So definitely check that out on their website. I found Stein, like if I was a prospective recruit, like I would buy into that. There seems to be like a realness and an honesty. And even though like some of the other coaches who are out there that are more like, look you in the eye, shake your hands, but not processing anything you're doing, like see what I'm doing with my eyes, like that kind of nonsense, like that doesn't fly with me. there just seems to be sort of a real component with him that I like. And what's interesting is like he's a Dan Lanning protege. I mean, he coached under Dan Lanning and kind of was behind Kenny Dillingham there for a while. Obviously, Kenny D's doing fantastic things there in Tempe, but like, look, I love Dan Lanning at Georgia. God, just he's not so much now at Oregon. I don't actively root for them. He makes it really hard. That's neither here nor there. But I will say though, like this was a coveted job. It would open up very late in the cycle, and I think Kentucky, moved on this pretty quickly because they thought the world of Stein. Like, think about this: you're hiring a first-time head coach and but a guy who called plays to come coach you, who used to play at your rival, your in-state rival. But that'd be like if hired George Godsey to be the head coach in some weird world. Like, it's never going to happen, but it's like that. Then again, Georgia did do that. They hired Vince Dooley, who had Auburn ties, and Auburn hired Pat Dye, who had Georgia ties. And look how that worked out for both of those schools, two absolute icons in the sport. So, think about that. Again, I was very impressed with what Will Stein said in that interview with Andy Nari, and wishing him and UK nothing but the best moving forward. Yeah, that's half the show. And let's move on to the second half of the show with our fourth segment with playoffs. You kidding me? This is a very late entrant into the episode today. I wrote about this, on a couple of sites, Dawn of the Dog and GBM Wolverine. CBS Sports, Brad Crawford put out his way too early 12-team college football playoff field. And definitely check that article out. He explained what he was doing. And again, like anytime anybody does one of these things, you got to give them credit for sticking their neck out to potentially get harpooned like a whale. And I'll do that a little bit with Crawford here too. But there's things that he did that I really like. There's things not so much. So for those who didn't see it, I'll rattle off who he has making the playoff. And again, this is a new format where like the four Power Four champions, whoever wins those leagues get AQ spots, and then the group of five gets one. It doesn't have to be the team who wins its league. It can just be the highest ranked one. So here's what he's got. The four teams he has a bye. He's got Miami as the one seed, Notre Dame as the two, Texas as the three, Indiana as the four. So you've got Miami winning the ACC, Texas winning the SEC, Indiana winning the Big 12, Big 10, and then Notre Dame getting in, with its cupcake, national independent at large nonsense. At five, you got Texas Tech winning the Big 12. Six, you've got Georgia as your SEC runner up. Oregon at seven as your Big 10 runner up. Ohio State as a Big Ten at large, LSU at nine as an SEC at large, Texas A&M as an SEC at large, Memphis coming in at 11 being your group of five, and then Michigan being your last team in with a 9-3 record as a Big Ten at large. And not only that, they lose to all three of the teams ahead of them in the Big Ten. They lose to Indiana, they lose to Ohio State, and they lose to Oregon. They don't even make it to Indy, but they still make this field, which I don't think is possible. But especially because Oklahoma is not making the playoff. That's the other signature game. You're not playing USC. So again, like I had a few bones to pick with what Crawford did. And again, I think the 12 teams he's gotten there are fine. I've got no problem with them. This is early. Again, we're talking like very early February, like February 3rd evening right now that I'm doing this. And again, we only had four teams make the playoff in back-to-back years, with Georgia out of the SEC, Indiana, Ohio State, and Oregon out of the Big Ten. I only got four teams right. I got Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, and Ole Miss. Those are the only teams that I picked correctly. So shows what we actually know. I think Cody got one better. I think he had Indiana in there. He didn't have Oregon. I think he had one other team that I did not. But that's neither here nor there. He had Ole Miss and Georgia and Ohio State in there as well. Um, but anyway, let's just kind of work our way through this. This is kind of how I've been trying to get logically here. And again, I'll share what mine would have been if I wrote it up. Okay, so the four teams that have made it the last two playoffs in Georgia, Indiana, Ohio State, Oregon, for the sake of argument, they're all getting in now. Like there's nothing that those four teams have done that leads me to believe that they're going to finish outside the top 10, top 12, if you will. You can say Georgia's winning the SEC or not. You can say any of those three teams in the Big Ten are winning that league or not. But like you lose credibility by not having those four in. So that's like I said, that's four. You're looking at two teams that barely missed out this past year, made it the year prior and won playoff games. That would be Texas and Notre Dame. Look, even though I will dump on them so much this offseason, I understand like why they're being hyped up. I get it. I would have them in my field as well, and which I do. That gets us to six. And then you get further down between, Miami and Texas Tech. Who do you have winning the ACC or the Big 12 right now? I would say beyond Miami, I think I like SMU next. That can change on a dime. And then beyond Texas Tech, maybe it's BYU, maybe it's Utah. But right now, like I'm looking at those two teams, they're just recruiting and paying NIL at a different level than everybody else in their league. So like again, I'd have to have them in there. So that gets us to eight. And I don't really have a definitive answer for who I'd have, winning the group of five. Memphis, sure. Charles Huff's just been job hopping. That's a good enough job in a good enough league. Why the hell not? So that gets us to nine. And again, maybe right now I'm leaning Western Michigan just to be bold, but maybe Boise State's the team. Maybe Hawaii is the team. I don't really, I don't think it's going to be Tulane, and I don't think it's going to be James Madison either. But we'll see where this all ultimately goes. So that really only leaves us three spots. And again, there's three teams that you're kind of looking for out of about a dozen or so. And this doesn't even include the wild card component that Bill Connolly touched on. Like there's usually some outlier nobody saw coming, like James Madison being the second group of five team in, or Arizona State 2 years ago. But maybe Connolly, I think, had mentioned Oklahoma State, which I think could happen. If the Big 12 is chaotic, they go 10-2 with basically North Texas players, that could totally happen. That's not out of the realm of possibility. Wouldn't shock me. But that's not being factored here. So the other three he's got, are what? Texas A&M, LSU, and Michigan. I'm kind of like I don't hate either of those. I think I ultimately ended up going. I think I would probably go LSU, Texas A&M, in Michigan. I think is my first team out. I've got USC in instead. So that's how that would go. So this would actually be my 12 team playoff right this instant. I would have pulling this up. I've got Ohio State at one, Georgia at two, Miami three, Texas Tech at four. Those are your Power Four champions. I've got Indiana at five, Texas at six, Notre Dame at seven, Oregon at eight, LSU nine, Texas A&M 10. USC is my last team in at 11, and then the group of five champion. Who cares? First four out would be Michigan, BYU, SMU, and Alabama. So like again, I think the order with the teams that like Crawford had in there are fine. I just think the order's all screwed up. Like let's be real with ourselves. For Miami and Notre Dame to get top two seeds, they have to go undefeated. They don't play like the most robust schedule. Like what we've seen over the last couple of years is like your top two seeds are going to be either Big Ten or SEC teams. Last year it was Indiana, Ohio State with Georgia at three. This past 2 years ago it was what Oregon, Georgia. Like you get what I'm saying. Like those leagues carry gravitas. Right now, the ACC doesn't do that. The Big 12 doesn't do that, and Notre Dame sure as hell doesn't do that. I mean, they took their ball and went home after not making the playoff. So I have some kind of bones to pick with that. As far as like the other thing is like, look, maybe my Georgia bias is showing. I mean, I've got Hines Ward and Jalen Carter behind me. Uga's here. We've got another Uga, and I've got a Stetson Bennett higher up there. Until I see it happen, Georgia's going to beat Texas, especially in Atlanta. They're 3-0 over the Longhorns. They beat them in Austin, they beat them in Atlanta, and they beat them in Athens. So even though everyone's like, I really like, if Arch Manning and Steve Sarkisian breathe, people are just like, just fainting, just fainting at the sight of them. It's like, come on, like they're good. They're going to make the playoff. Maybe Arch will do whatever he needs to do, but like this is bulletin board material for Kirby Smart and his team and his guys. So I think Georgia was also very young a year ago. And granted, Texas is going to be one of the handful of teams this year right now that I think can win a national title. If I had to kind of go through, I would say that the teams in the top eight right there, you know, I think LSU is a step behind because, it's new with Lane Kiffin and Sam Levitt and all this stuff coming together. But I think there's a world where Notre Dame could do it. There's a world where Texas could do it. Georgia, um, Miami, Texas Tech, and then obviously, Indiana, Ohio State, and Oregon. Like they could all there's pathways where they could all get it done. I don't think it's going to be Indiana because I think they pull back a little bit just because like you can't recreate that season that you did a year ago. Maybe Miami does a little bit too. Probably not. Texas Tech, we'll see what Brendan Sorsby does, replacing the likes of Baron Morton under center. But that's kind of where I'm at with all of that. I guess like the last thing I wanted to touch on is like the Michigan thing, and I wrote about this for GB and Wolverine twice. Really, the big thing is I think Michigan's and USC are two teams right now that we're like looking at like they are right about the cut line about how we view them. We know Bryce Underwood's immensely talented. We know Jaden Mayava is immensely talented quarterback too. We think Lincoln Riley and Kyle Whittingham are good enough coaches to make the playoff in this 12-team format. We've seen Lincoln Riley do it in a 4-team format at Oklahoma, granted when they played the Big 12. If there would have been a 12-team format when Whittingham was at Utah, he probably would have made it a couple of times. But that's neither here nor there. I don't know USC's schedule off the top of my head, but I have looked at Michigan's a little bit. And look, they have a brutal schedule. They got to play all three teams in the Big Ten that made the playoff a year ago. You host Indiana, they got to play at Autzen, and then you got to play at the Horseshoe. And then, you also host Oklahoma, who's going to be playoff viable too. Well, we'll see what the Sooners are going to do. Again, like they're kind of in that cluster of teams like, fighting for the last couple spots in there, with the Michigans, with, LSU, A&M, Ole Miss, Alabama, BYU, SMU, whomever, Florida, Auburn, whomever else you really want to throw in there at this point. It doesn't matter. But look, Michigan, I don't see them making the playoff if they don't go 10-2. Even though they'll have a bunch of quality wins, a bunch of quality losses, excuse me, that we saw what happened with Texas. They were 9-3. They didn't play in a conference championship. We couldn't put them in there. Michigan went 9-3 a year ago or something like that. They had to beat Ohio State to make it interesting. They didn't do it. And look, we have got a 9-3 team in, but that was because Clemson had to win a very bad ACC and they beat SMU. And that helped propel them in some capacities. But like, look, Whittingham has never made the playoff, but they're hiring him to do so. More importantly, they're hiring him to not be Sherm Moore. They're hiring him to be an adult, a guy. He's in his mid-60s. He's already like going to be a Hall of Fame head coach for his days at Utah. Why does he need this? Because he wants to win. More importantly, he's got better resources than he's ever had. So, I'm rooting for him too. And again, Whittingham to Michigan makes me like them a lot more. Also, I get along with site expert Chris Peterson a lot. He's great. So, like, I get to write whatever I want on GVM all the time. I'll push back. So, I've been having fun writing content there throughout the regular days of work and everything like that. So, give Brad Crawford credit for putting forth a projected playoff bracket and everything like that. Again, hosting these shows by myself is so hard. Doing back to back with blog and dirty, I'm so cooked. So let's move on. Let's move on with our penultimate topic here with some TIN10. This is an idea that I came up with the other day on a walk. My fiance's like, "You need to get out of the house more, dude." I'm like, "Okay, sure. I don't want to spend any money. We just all we do is spend money." Um, I came up with this relatively sober, or I think I was sober. Outside of the first, I've been sober this whole year. We'll see how that goes. Valentine's Day is coming up, and we're gonna be going to Germany in April or whatever. That's the Bueller lifestyle here. But what I'm gonna do for TIN10 is I'm gonna power rank the 10 NFL head coaching hires based on how maybe an NFL draft prospect should feel coming in. Like if I'm a blue chip player, I'm going to be going in, the first 3 rounds, like how I should feel about the hires that are made. And again, this is different than power ranking head coaches because like, look, we've got of these 10 guys who got hired, 2 of which have won Super Bowls as head coach, and John Harbaugh and Mike McCarthy. But I don't necessarily know if either of them are going to show up very high on this list here. And I'll try to explain like why I had this. And again, I'll rattle off the 10 who have been hired in order of when they were hired. Then I'll work my way 10-1 on how I would feel if I was a guy coming in. So the first head coach hired was former Baltimore Ravens head coach John Harbaugh. He goes to the New York Giants, replacing Brian Daboll. Then it was my Atlanta Falcons hiring former Cleveland Browns head coach Kevin Stefanski, and he replaces Raheem Morris in Atlanta. Not long after that, the Miami Dolphins hire former Green Bay Packers defensive coordinator, Boston College head coach Jeff Hafley. He replaces Mike McDaniel down there in South Beach. Then Robert Saleh, the former New York Jets and head coach and San Francisco 49ers defensive coordinator, he replaces Brian Callahan in Tennessee. Then there's a little bit of a pause, and then a former Michigan defensive coordinator and Los Angeles Chargers defensive coordinator, Jesse Minter, he takes over for John Harbaugh in Baltimore. So he goes from working for one Harbaugh to replacing Harbaugh. It's wild. Then the Pittsburgh Steelers, we thought they were going to hire Los Angeles Rams defensive coordinator Chris Schuler. Did not happen. They hired former Dallas Cowboys and Green Bay Packers head coach Mike McCarthy, who is a Yenzer to his core. That one was wild. I don't still understand that hire. Good job, Raiders. Then, after the Buffalo Bills fired Sean McDermott, they eventually promoted offensive coordinator Joe Brady from within. Again, this is the former passing game coordinator from the LSU Tigers, the Joe Burrow. Then it got weird. After Jimmy Haslam fired Kevin Stefanski, he tried to make the next head coach keep Jim Schwartz on as defensive coordinator. Nobody wanted him. Jim Schwartz wanted the role, didn't get him. And then they hired former Baltimore Ravens offensive coordinator, Georgia offensive coordinator, Southern Miss head coach, Tampa Bay Buccaneers offensive coordinator, Todd Monken. Todd Monken doesn't stay anywhere more than 3 or 4 years. This is gonna be fun. Happy that he got the opportunity, but Jim Schwartz, they hired him because they thought he'd work with Schwartz, and Schwartz is like, y'all kick rocks. Then the final two, it looks as though Seattle Seahawks and former New Orleans Saints offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak is going to replace Pete Carroll as the head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. And then the last coaching hire, what LA Rams coach, quarterbacks coach, I think Mike LaFleur is going to be replacing Jonathan Gannon as head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. So that's kind of how those are the 10 hires. Doesn't look like there's going to be any more. Thank God. I thought this was a really weak hire because, like, oh, look, 10 teams had new coaches. It's so dumb. NFL's so dumb. Dumb owners across the board. So here's how I'm gonna do this. At number 10, if I was that we're talking like if I'm a first round pick or second round pick or third round pick, how would I feel about going to these teams? At number 10, I got to be honest with you, not fired up about Mike LaFleur with the Cardinals. You hire Matt LaFleur's kid brother. Matt LaFleur can't win crucial playoff games in Green Bay. The Cardinals are a very cheap ownership with Michael Bidwell. Jonathan Gannon, who I thought was a very savvy defensive mind, it really struggled. You've got a very aloof player at Kyler Murray at quarterback. Even though I do like Monty Austin as a GM, I'm not saying this is a dead franchise, but there's just no juice with this hire. I mean, they had guys who were up for this gig that just said no thanks. Like Anthony Campanelli of the Jaguars said no. Grant Udinsky said no. Raheem Morris ultimately decided to go replace Robert Saleh as a defensive coordinator in San Francisco. And even though I could be wrong here, I just kind of feel like this hire by the Cardinals, like we're going to be back doing this 3 years from now. Maybe it'll work out, but like I'm not bullish on that. At number 9, I've got I've got Mike McCarthy with the Steelers. Be careful what you wish for, but also you had to rip the Band-Aid off. The Steelers, even though I have a Steeler behind me, they haven't been the same since this guy played. Since Hines Ward retired, like the Steelers have not been the same team. They lack accountability. It's just kind of a bunch of guys who are basically just skating by. And obviously the Rooneys, like, oh, we've only had like 3 coaches in 60 years. Like, who cares? You hired Mike McCarthy. He was doing cartwheels in the streets, but I don't think he can even see his toes. Like, you hired a guy who's from Pittsburgh to be the head coach. You think Aaron Rodgers wants to play with him? No. Who's their quarterback? Like, what are we doing? You know, even though Cleveland's dysfunctional, Baltimore's the better job. Um, I'll touch on Baltimore much later on this list, but if I'm the Steelers, I'm like, what are we doing? This is a team that hasn't won a playoff game since TJ Watt's been drafted by them. That's been a decade. Like it's just so frustrating. But at least what we can do at this point is like McCarthy's going to fail. He's not going to coach for 20 years. It's just not it's not in his DNA. It's not what's happening here. I thought that was a really bad hire. It's probably my least favorite hire of anybody in the cycle. But again, who knows what I know? Maybe I'm just a noted Steelers hater. That's rough. And then okay, moving on to number 8. Believe it or not, I've got John Harbaugh here. there's a lot of things about this hire that I don't like. Each with each passing day. And look, I go with, every Friday, maybe not this week, but I go with, Rich Quinones on Q, and he's a Giants fan. He's doing cartwheels in the streets about them getting John Harbaugh. You still have Joe Shane as GM. I don't think he's very good. You know, you have John Mara who's boring, and then Steve Tisch, who's obviously been tied to some really tough stuff there in the news. Then you hire Matt Nagy as your offensive coordinator because Todd Monken's now the head coach in Cleveland. In the wake of Harbaugh getting hired, I'm just like, I'm liking this less and less and less. Honestly, I like Brian Daboll joining Robert Saleh's staff in Nashville a lot more. A lot of those expectations. And look, you gotta. The other thing with Harbaugh that kind of scares me a little bit is like, look, I know he's been in the NFL for a long time. I know his brother's in college. This is not a position coach. This is a special teams guy. He's supposed to be about communicating with everybody, but he kind of lost the locker room in the end with the Ravens. And I'll be straight with you. You know, if Navarro Bowman didn't hold, John Harbaugh doesn't have a Super Bowl because the 2012 Atlanta Falcons would have beaten them. I'm just saying that. When in Ray Lewis and his deer antler spray. It's so dumb. I Maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe I'm just being a contrarian ass. If I'm the Giants, I'm prospect. I'm going to the Giants. I'm like, is this really any better? You kind of feel like you put lipstick on a pig. Moving on to number seven, I'm going to go with Joe Brady to the Bills. And even though he had success there, with the 2019 LSU Tigers, again, you still have Brandon Beane in there, and more importantly, you still have Terry Pegula as your owner. You've been promoted from within. You have a late round pick. This is kind of an era with the Bills where it's like Josh Allen's going to ask himself, do you want to be Dan Marino or do you want to be John Elway? Maybe he wants to be the latter, but maybe he's really just the former. And at this point, like if you're a prospect of the Bills, I mean, like God, Pagula threw Keon Coleman to the bus. Like, why would you want to go there? I know this is like football first culture and everything like that. The Sabres have been trash since I've been writing. I don't think they've come close to the playoffs in a decade. Again, I'm not the biggest NHL guy, but like I know the Sabres have been awful. Penn State hasn't exactly been thriving this past year. I just kind of feel like there's just layers to this with the Bills. You're not going to have great picks. Maybe there's opportunities. I've talked about my guy, CJ Allen, potentially going from Georgia to play for the Bills. I think that might work out, but Patriots, they're back in the Super Bowl, man. They've got the better head coach and Mike Vrabel. They've got a quarterback who's growing and thriving and ascending in Drake May. I'm not saying they're going to win on Sunday, but they might. Uh, but yeah, right now with the Bills, I'm like, there's also, Joe Brady, when he was with Carolina with Matt Rule, another college guy, was terrible. Did not work. I'm happy that he has been able to reinvent himself after a tough gig there, but I don't know if I love this hire. If I were him, I would have waited another year or maybe gone and replace Zach Taylor in Cincinnati and work with Joe Burrow. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh on the Bills, but I think that it's more of about a Brandon Beane sort of thing here. Moving on up to number six, I've got Robert Saleh with the Titans. This is a guy when he was with the Jets, they're picking towards the top of the draft because they sucked all the time. And again, Joe Douglas, made a lot of good picks there for the Jets, but he also drafted Zach Wilson. He's terrible. And I could have told you he was terrible since COVID season. But I do think that Saleh's well respected in this industry, a very savvy defensive mind, is going to surround himself with good people. I mean, he did that in New York a little bit too. Jeff Ulbricht's been both thought of as a DC from my Atlanta Falcons. Um, Brian Daboll is willing to go with him to Nashville, and you've got Cam Ward here. And again, like maybe you can partner up with Mike Borgensi a little bit here. I think the Titans are going to have a lot of good draft capital to work with. My concern is you have a terrible owner named Adams Strunk. I think she's just bottom tier. Just as much of a meddler as her cheapskate father was. Just one of the worst worst owners in football. Like she did like an in-person interview. It's like, oh, I couldn't bother to show up. And again, like I probably like a cease and desist from the Titans, but who gives a shit? And you can't spell Titans without Tennessee Titans without shit. I don't care. I do think that the staff that they're putting together there in Nashville can cut through. The problem is Houston's got a good staff. Jacksonville's got a good staff. Indianapolis, against all odds, has a good staff. I think they got a GM problem with Chris Ballard, and maybe a Carly Ursay Gordon will finally come to her senses that her dad never did and move on from him. But I think Shane Steichen's pretty good, so maybe the Titans will be able to hold their own. And again, I thought Brian Callahan and Cam Ward were going to work. Maybe I'm not the biggest Cam Ward guy. I don't necessarily know if he's really a foxhole guy, but we'll see what happens. He was all about the U. So that's what I got there. And at number five, I've got my guy, Kevin Stefanski with the Falcons. Again, you don't have a whole hell of a lot of draft picks. I mean, Terry Fontenot set this team up for success. Ian Cunningham's coming in. He just had his intro presser with the Falcons as GM. You can definitely check that out on the Blog Area podcast. That just went live earlier today, right Tuesday evening and everything like that. Matt Ryan's in the office in a more bigger role. But obviously, this franchise hasn't made the playoffs in 8 years. Every team in the NFC has made it more recently than the Falcons. The only team in football who's made the playoffs less frequently than them is the Jets. And then they brought in Tanner Ingstrand from the Jets as part of Kevin Stefanski's staff. There are a lot of pieces there in Atlanta staff that I like. Obviously, they were able to retain Jeff Ulbrich and Nate Ollie and other things like that. Your offensive coordinator is Tommy Rees. Again, he has college ties from his days playing at Notre Dame, being on the Notre Dame staff, and then being at Alabama with the Browns too. He's called plays. Ingstrands as well. Is I think he's like passing game coordinator. Yeah, Alex Van Pelt, a really good position coach and developer of talent. He's a quarterbacks coach. There's things to be had there. And then obviously Bill Callahan, Brian Callahan's father, one of the greatest offensive line coaches of all time, former Raiders and Nebraska head coach. He's in the building too. I think Craig Ackerman's the special teams guy. Anyway, I'm just rattling off names with the Falcons, but Stefanski's not really a college guy, never really has been. So maybe you sit there and think like, oh, yeah, maybe it didn't work out. So maybe you buy into the Shador Sanders nonsense of it. But I mean, Carson Schlesinger might win Rookie of the Year, and he was a second round pick by the Browns. It really comes down to how well you like Ian Cunningham and Matt Ryan. I think Stefanski is the guy that people are probably the most apprehensive about here in Dirty Bird Nation. Everybody knew that Matt Ryan was going to get the president of football gig, and then they were hoping that it was going to be Ian Cunningham. It's all about alignment here in Atlanta. So, I'm not going to be a homer and say it's the top one, but this is there's good bones to be had here. There's a lot of fun, exciting players here, but like we've also seen the Falcons whipped on draft picks, and this is a first-time GM, a failed former head coach, and a first-time president of football. So we'll see. Moving on up to four, I actually do have Todd Monken. I think Andrew Berry is a fantastic GM. I think Jimmy Haslam's a terrible owner. I think he's probably the worst owner in football. Probably more so than I mean actually Woody Johnson, Amy Adams-Strunk, just some bad ones. Mike Brown, just they're all in the AFC. They all suck. Anyway, Todd Monken I will always hold in such tremendous regard because he was the offensive coordinator that brought Georgia to national championships. Granted, he doesn't stick anywhere for very long. I think since he played quarterback at Knox way back in the day, he's only been somewhere for more than 4 years, three times. I believe that was with Eastern Michigan, the Jaguars when he was a receivers coach, I think on like Jack Del Rio's staff maybe. And then crossover a little bit with Mike Smith, I think there in Jacksonville. And then obviously I think Eastern Michigan, like when he was the head coach of Southern Miss, only there for 3 years. Bucks only 3 years, Georgia only 3 years, Ravens only 3 years. So like I think he'll have some working intel of guys coming in, but then again, he's been 3 years removed from being in college. So maybe some of the guys that are coming out in this draft, he will have scouted, he will have, recruited a little bit from his time at Georgia. Maybe that'll help Cleveland a good bit. So I mean, like you can really only go up from here if you're the Browns. I think that the expectations are really low, but I think that there's opportunities to be played and to be had. And I don't necessarily know if Monken's really an NFL head coach, but you got to strike while the iron's hot and you got to take advantage of the opportunity. So like I'm a little bit higher on this from a incoming perspective than I am with other teams, just because like I think he's got a little bit better sense and feel for what's going on. Moving on up to number three, I've got Jeff Hafley. Look, the Dolphins are so screwy. It's because they've got Stephen Ross as an owner. It's a port town. Everybody, the fans are kind of dumb. They're all about Dan Marino, and then they worship the wrong things. But there's uniformity here. Jeff Hafley was in Green Bay with John Eric Sullivan. Jeff Hafley was formerly, head coach of Boston College. Pretty good when he was there. He would know he has, I think he was with the 49ers and then he was with Ryan Day, I think, for a year at Ohio State before he got the BC gig. And again, they're all about high and tight haircuts and stuff that I would never do. But I think if you're the Dolphins and you're coming in, you have what, new head coach, new GM. Hafley's been a head coach before. It's kind of similar to what we got in Atlanta, but I think the big difference is Hafley's coached in college before. So, like, again, he'll know these players more so than Monken. I mean, he was only in Green Bay for 2 years. He actually left. We actually did one of our early episodes, in our first season about Hafley leaving BC. I think that was only on video, but like, or only on audio at that point. But pretty interesting opportunity. I think that this is a sneaky decent hire. I think there's alignment here. And obviously he was the third head coach hired, behind Harbaugh and Stefanski right before Saleh. Miami saw what they wanted and they made it happen. So I think I'm kind of bullish on this for the Dolphins. But then again, I thought Brian Callahan was going to make it work in Tennessee and most certainly did not. Can you overcome a dysfunctional culture? I don't know, but I'm rooting for Hafley to do that. Then moving on up to our top two. At number two, I've got Clint Kubiak there with the Raiders. This has nothing to do with Kubiak. I think he's self-described as a wet blanket. He does come from the Shanahan coaching tree, under Mike McDonald, who has a very strong ties from his time at Michigan and being at Georgia and everything like that to the college game. Obviously, you're the son of Gary Kubiak, former star head coach of the Texans, Super Bowl champion with the Broncos. But this is all about this. You're working for Tom Brady. Yeah, you're also working for Mark Davis, and that doesn't work out. But you're also inheriting players like Colton Miller along the offensive line, Brock Bowers at tight end, Ashton Jeanty at running back. You also have the number one pick, and you're going to get an absolutely galvanizing personality in Fernando Mendoza. And Mendoza doesn't throw any completions. Granted, I don't necessarily know if he's as athletic as what he looked on tape or on the screen there at Indiana, but like I'd be fired up to play for the Raiders, man. Look, Fernando Mendoza is the opposite of a black hat. He's the he is the most enthusiastic person of all time. But you know what? There's some positivity there, and I think it can work out. More importantly, he won with a very negative person to coach Sig. Indiana won 16 games. They went 16-0. They won the college football playoff. Why not the Raiders? I'm pretty fired up about that. And then without question, number one best coach for this situation, if you're an incoming draft prospect, Jesse Minter with the Ravens. Not only do you have a guy that was in college 2 years ago, with Michigan, one of Jim Harbaugh's greatest disciples, but you're also going, to the Ravens, where his older brother John was the head coach. The Ravens have a phenomenal scouting department. Eric DeCosta learned everything from Ozzie Newsome. Ravens just do it better. They just do it better. They don't win as much as they should, and it's probably got something to do with quarterback play and coaching and everything like that. I don't mean to throw like shade at like Lamar Jackson, but we know what it is. Minter not only knows these college players, he knows defense that fits right into what the Ravens are about. Also, the fact his dad, Rick Minter, was a former head coach of, the Cincinnati Bearcats back in the 90s. I think it was coaches who served under him were Jimbo Fisher and Sam Pittman for what it's worth. So I think it's just a perfect combination of like the Ravens are just going to crash their draft. Also, they didn't make the playoffs this past year. So like they're going to be picking much higher than expected. One of the Ravens picking the teens. When are they ever doing that? Well, they are now. So if the Ravens are looking at me, I'd be very, very fired up about this if I was a top 96 prospect for sure. So that's kind of what I got right there for our penultimate topic. Let's move on to our last topic of the day with a guy remembering Super Bowls. Went a little bit long today because that one was a little more long-winded, but this is what we're going to do. So touch on some of my favorite Super Bowls I ever watching as a kid, growing up, covering whatever it is. So I'm 36. The first Super Bowl that I remember watching would have been 31. That's the one where the Packers with Brett Favre beat the Patriots with Drew Bledsoe. I grew up a massive Drew Bledsoe fan because of that team. I think I had a video game, NFL Quarterback Club 98 with Brett Favre on the cover. I'd play with the Patriots. Bill Parcells was still the coach. Maybe it was Pete Carroll at that point. I don't really remember. I actually have no recollection of Pete Carroll being the head coach of the Patriots, but I remember Drew Bledsoe and I remember Curtis Martin, and I had a hell of a lot of fun with them. Remember Tom Tupa, the punter. They didn't win, and then I think that year, like I think that was Parcells' last year coaching the Patriots. He just up and left. Obviously, my Atlanta Falcons, the original Dirty Birds, made a couple years later in '98, and that was a fun time. That really got me into football for really the first time ever. Um, Felt like we could have beaten the. I was just like, yeah, we're gonna beat the Vikings. Everyone's like, no, you're not. We did. We get to the Broncos. I'm like, I don't know. Elway and Terrell Davis were pretty damn good at that point. So I remember that one as well. Trying to think what else is, also stands out. Obviously, Super Bowl 34 was in Atlanta the next year. It was with the Rams Titans, greatest show on turf. Going through all of that. I don't want to route through every Super Bowl here. I don't really want to do this. I don't want to talk about 28 to 3 either. I'll say this. I'll think about the top of my head. One Super Bowl that I found I really enjoyed. One that like I really did not, and maybe one other one that like really stands out. Like if I have to show my kids what a Super Bowl is about, it is one that I really enjoyed. So again, from like a non-rooting perspective, again, we're gonna take, whatever teams that I root for out of it, Falcons, whomever. I would say I always found the one like '08 between the Steelers and Cardinals to be very compelling. You got a team like the Cardinals who, won a very bad division. Kurt Warner just played out of his mind, really helped him get in the Hall of Fame. And then the Steelers, Big Ben winning his second one, first one with Tomlin. A lot of great defensive scores. I remember watching that one in the fraternity house while I was pledging. A couple of Steelers fans there, they're pretty fired up about it. It's just one of the ones that like, maybe I wasn't paying as much attention to, but I think just in the whole of what it provided, I think that was a very enjoyable one. One that I didn't enjoy, last year's one with the Chiefs and Eagles, just it was over immediately. Chiefs had no shot. Kind of like this, the Chiefs, also with the Bucks, in Tampa during COVID. Like when a team clearly doesn't have it. Also the 13 one where the Seahawks just beat the Broncos like a drum. They snapped the ball and hit Peyton Manning off the head and they lost right before a snowstorm. Like whenever those happen, you're just like, ugh, like, am I really going to pay attention? Like, you just tune it out immediately. And the thing is, like, in the moment, it's not good. It's not going to be a lot of fun. And then, another one that, like, besides like my kids, if I had to show another one that was fun besides the '08 one. And again, I don't remember all the numbers or anything like that. I think I'm trying to think relatively recently. Ones I'm not going to show them the one that was here between the Patriots and Rams. That was no scoring. Frozen hell down here. Um, I think the one with the 52 between the Eagles and Patriots was pretty compelling. I'm always remember Brandon Graham or whomever it was like knocking the ball out of Brady's hand. That was cool. Maybe the first Chiefs Super Bowl over the Niners. That one was fun. Honestly, I had a blast with the 21 one with the Rams and Bengals just because it was different. It was just two teams that we didn't expect to see here. I love that Bengals team. Joe Burrow's again one of my favorite players who never played for Georgia. And I always kind of rooted for the Bengals because like they're just a crap team too, like the Falcons. When a crap team almost wins, you're pulling for them, man. You most certainly are. And this was episode 248 of False Start. You can follow me, John Buhler, on Twitter or the X at Buhler118. You can follow my absent-minded, absent colleague, co-host Cody Williams at the Sizzle20. You can follow the show at CFP False Start. Like, rate, listen, subscribe, review on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere there's podcasts. Give us a 5-star review. Really helps the show grow. We're at 53 subscribers right now. Want to get to 55 very soon. Again, we're going to have shorts back here at some point. Cody's going to show me how to do that. I've been able to figure out how to do some of the stuff in the back end with Canva, but again, he's more of that kind of guy. I'm kind of more of like putting the outline together. We've got a pretty good thing going here. You guys got a pretty good thing going here. I'm going to take the Seahawks to win the Super Bowl by a lot. That's kind of where I'm at with all this. I don't know, man. One more football game. Then it's going to be, basketball season, and then really the heart of the off season. That's when the show gets really, really good. Once again, thanks for listening, and this is False Start.